It's great to see such a big turnout for this very live and urgent matter. We were just talking before we came in, and we were reflecting that for all five of us here, and indeed for many of you, this question has been going on now for, well, in its current form, at least 20 and arguably almost 30 years, which in the great sweep of history is a sparrow's flight, but in the course of one life it becomes quite dominating. So this is a question that has dominated the lives of many of us in this room, and one of the exciting things about tonight's event is that we'll open it up and try and democratize it a bit, and we have, I'm sure, both Serbs and Kosovan Albanians in the same room, so it should make for the kind of dialogue that you no longer get very much of in Kosovo itself. Let me introduce to you the four people we have here. Starting at the far end, Misha Glenny, you will know. I'd said to Misha I was going to introduce him as a man who comes to us from the world of international crime. Misha's book is called McMafia. It's out next month. It's a blockbuster on international organised crime. But you will know him, of course, as an expert in the Balkans. He was there for the BBC when the wars of the dissolution of Yugoslavia began. Daut Dauti is a journalist and a former spokesman for the Kosovo government, now living in London, of course. Tim Judah is the Balkans correspondent of The Economist, but also was there when the wars began in the early 1990s. He's the author of several books. The best known, I think, is The Serbs, History, Myth, and the Destruction of Yugoslavia. And Dr. Nebojša Vladisavljević is a tutorial fellow at the LSE and is also a specialist in democratization, nationalist mobilization, with a focus obviously on former Yugoslavia. Let me start with the obvious question with you, Misha. Was it right for Britain, the United States, France, Sweden, most of the European Union to recognize the independence of Kosovo?
Well, I'm going to equivocate on this because I feel very strongly that while a process should have begun to sort out the final status, that the one that was undertaken for the two and a half years prior to February the 17th was, I would say, almost wholly mismanaged, and so that the outcome of the final status negotiations has not resolved many of the problems that it was aiming to resolve. I mean, quite specifically, I don't think the Ahtisaari process was a success. I think the British and the Americans told Ahtisaari that this was a done deal, and Ahtisaari came into the operation and discovered that actually it wasn't a done deal, and that he found it very taxing and difficult, and did not succeed in coming up with an agreement. He came up with a set of principles, but this was not an agreement. And in the meanwhile, Russia was going through all sorts of transitions, and when it was handed the Ahtisaari agreement, decided that it was not going to back it. You had an emergency attempt under Wolfgang Ischinger to try and come to a deal which Belgrade would agree to. I think if you'd have had Ischinger there in the first place 2 years ago, you may have got a deal. As it is, we now have a recognition which is inconclusive, that you have a divided Kosovo, you have 5 governments in Kosovo, or 5 governing structures, to wit the Kosovo government, the Belgrade government, UNMIK, ULEX, and KFOR as a form of government, and you have a very divided situation in the international community, inasmuch that there has not been the sort of rush, again as the Americans and British were not only predicting but telling the Germans and French were going to happen. There has not been a rush of countries to recognize Kosovo, and so it appears that Russia had more of a finger on the pulse of global sentiment than the Brits and the Americans did, because It's not just Russia, it's China, it's Brazil, it's India, it's Indonesia, it's South Africa, and very striking, there are very few Islamic states which have recognized the Republic of Kosovo up until now. And the problem with this is, for me, is a European Union problem, is that the European Union is putting its credibility on the line, and it has not done its homework diplomatically. And this is going to, I mean, I don't think it's a disaster. I don't see a cataclysm as a consequence of this recognition, but there are still several fundamental problems which have not been resolved and been deflected rather into a different direction.
Well, let's get on to what those problems are a little later. Daut, what do you think?
Well, I think that there was no other solution, there was no other possibility except to recognize the independence. Of course, there was one, to take the place back to Serbia, to where Misha Glenny and others think that Kosovo belongs. But to the Albanians...
I have to say, I don't think that Kosovo belongs to Serbia. I never said that.
Well, indirectly,
I don't know where you derived that from. I've never written that.
If there is a bad solution for independence, then it means that Kosovo should go back to Serbia, which never was there. But what this means to the Albanians and the majority of the population is that taking these people back to the butcher, it means that that's the only other solution. And if you have these two solutions in front of you, then Britain, America, and all democratic countries have taken the right path, the right stand, and they have recognized Kosovo as an independent state.
But what do you make of Misha's point, though, that certainly a week or 10 days before the Declaration of Independence, the pro-independence governments in the European Union were telling us all that all the European members, with the possible exception of Cyprus, were ready to fall in behind this. That even Spain was prepared to do a deal. But in fact, we haven't got that, have we?
Yeah, but we haven't, we didn't come to the end of the road. We haven't come to the end of the process. It's a process where, you see, Montenegro has only been recognized by 93 countries, so where are 100? So Kosovo, until now, has been recognized out of 35 or 36 different countries. And why other countries are not doing that? Some of them will be doing it soon, some of them will be doing later, some will probably not take a few years. But going back to most international powers have done so, have recognized it, and have given a go to Kosovo to continue with the democratic building process. Who hasn't recognized Kosovo so far? Of course, Islamic countries, mainly Arab, not Islamic. And we have to go behind the reason, and which will tell you why they did not recognize independence of Kosovo. I was going through the Arab press lately, and you see why. Because they were so much in love with Yugoslavia, and they wrongly think that Serbia is Yugoslavia now. And they want to put forward the case that if you recognize Kosovo, why don't you recognize Palestine anyway? And we have seen in their press and in their diplomatic relationship that Albanians are not the good Muslims anyway, so why we recognize them?
Tim?
Well, I agree. I just think it was inevitable, and I don't think that there was much choice. And even if it is a mess now, I think that it was time after 8 years to end the chapter that we've lived through for the last 8 years and to begin a new chapter. I mean, it's true, the diplomats wanted final status, but, you know, it makes me think of Denis McShane, Britain's former Europe minister, who, on his visit to Kosovo in April 2004, is reputed to, well, certainly said, I don't know if he said it directly to Ibrahim Rugova, the then president of Kosovo, he snapped reputedly that there is no such thing as final status, and final status is when we are all dead. And I think that a lot of people would have been very happy to keep this, the previous state of affairs, you know, going forever, but I don't think that it was possible, and therefore, difficult as it may be, that was the right decision to make.
But you say there was no alternative. There was an alternative. The alternative was full autonomy within an all-embracing...
No, of course there wasn't an alternative. Everybody knows that you couldn't fit, you know, 1.9 million people back into a Serbia, into a, you know, people would, you know, so profoundly hostile to Serbia, and vice versa. I mean, everybody knows that wasn't a realistic solution. The only solution might have been to kind of continue in a way the way that we'd had, but I think with that we'd come to the end of the road there.
Nebojša.
It seems to me that the recognition as it occurred recently didn't solve any of the key issues in the conflict. Clearly, some of the options that existed earlier are now closed, and there's no way that Kosovo would accept any sort of, however broad autonomy within Serbia. And there is some element of credibility behind it, simply because the US and key European states have recognized Kosovo as an independent state. However, Kosovo is still a highly divided society. As Misha said earlier, northern Kosovo is almost fully under self-rule of Kosovo Serbs, as well as a number of enclaves. And it seems highly unlikely that Kosovo Albanians will be able to get control over these areas. Now, the other element of the conflict, that is the relation between the Serb government and actually Kosovo as such, also hasn't been resolved. The Ahtisaari's proposal and this recognition that has occurred earlier has actually tried to sort this problem out, in a way saying that Kosovo will never again be Serbia, and that's over. Serbian government and Serbs can actually forget about it. But in fact, it is far from this. Kosovo has been recognized so far only by a very small number of countries, although again the US is there and large European states. If you look at other states such as Russia, China, India, a large number of Muslim states, I mean, they haven't recognized Kosovo, and many will never actually do so. Even a number of
for reasons,
EU
but the reasons that many of those countries have refused to recognize Kosovo have very little to do with Kosovo or even the Balkans.
Of course.
It's quite questions to do with their own domestic political agenda, isn't it?
Sure. I mean, countries like Russia and their representatives would say, well, okay, this is support for Serbia, but essentially it is about their own problems, because recognizing Kosovo as an independent state means essentially setting a precedent that secession is actually legitimate in international relations, and many states see that as a very serious threat to their internal order, because many states harbor secessionist or potentially secessionist movements. Again, it is still not clear whether the precedent has been set, because very few countries have actually recognized Kosovo. It's still not dangerous. But if it goes further, then it may actually create a serious demonstration effect in other places.
And so, for the sake of Spanish fears about the Basque provinces, for the sake of Russian fears about Chechnya and elsewhere, it was legitimate and reasonable to let Kosovo and the entire Western Balkan region carry on in this uncertainty, sinking further and further into this sort of black hole of poverty.
Certainly not. I mean, but there have been other options available to actually deal with this problem. It is a very complex problem. It cannot be resolved by simple gestures. It has both internal and external dimensions, and both interests of Albanians and Serbs have to be taken seriously. By this attempt, actually, at Ahtisaari's proposal, only the interests of Kosovo Albanians have been taken into account. Interests of Kosovo Serbs and the Serbian government have been fully ignored. And of course, this plan is a non-starter for both sides.
Daut.
Yes, but what I agree here is that the internationals have had always a wrong attitude towards the Serbs and towards the Albanians as well. They never went deep into studying what these two people want, what is the problem with these two people. So immediately when the UNMIK and OSCE moved into Pristina in 1999, so they gave a very bad impression to the Serbs inside Kosovo. They never wanted to deal with them directly and properly as they were supposed to in trying to build a democratic process there. Instead, they went to ask and see, where to find the proper answer, and they went to Belgrade. So they gave a very bad signal to the Albanians and to the Serbs that Belgrade still counts. Belgrade is very important, while in reality is not. Belgrade cannot really control and will not be controlling Kosovo anymore. This is the biggest mistake they made. Then it's still being made in the same sense, because the Belgrade international community goes to Belgrade not with a clear agenda, telling to them, let's for example take war criminals. If you do deliver them, you get award, but if you don't, nothing happens.
Tim, we got round that first those first introductory remarks when nobody mentioned Resolution 1244. The truth is that whatever the political justification for the recognition of Kosovo independence, it's illegal, isn't it?
Well, the truth is that Resolution 1244 was a document which was designed to end the bombing. It wasn't a blueprint for the future of Kosovo. And it,
No, but
and it
that's
has a
not-
lot of contradictory points.
Sure, that's your interpretation of its origin, but its status in international law is that it's an extant resolution passed by the Security Council of the United Nations, and it recognises the legitimacy of Serbian sovereignty in Kosovo.
Yeah, but it also recognises that there should be a process to leading to a final status, and if that you could then argue that that process failed, therefore there's no reason to keep Kosovo.
In whose
locked
judgment
the
did it
situation.
fail?
Sorry?
In whose judgment did it fail?
Well, it failed in the judgment of certainly 90% of the people who live there, for starters, and all how many people are there in the contact group? How many states are there in the contact group? 5 out of 6 countries on the contact group, which were the important players dealing with Kosovo. But you know, there are 2 principles which have been at stake here, which is one, of course, is the principle of the territorial integrity of states, which is enshrined in 1244, but there is also the principle of self-determination. It's very difficult to argue that, yeah, it's fine for 650,000 Montenegrins to have an independent state, but it's not okay for 1.9 million Albanians to have a state. I mean, you know, you can... All these arguments are legitimate, but they're all contradictory, and for every 100 international lawyers you can find to say one thing, you can find 100 international lawyers to argue
yeah,
the
but
other.
what Resolution 1244, including the recognition of Serbian sovereignty in Kosovo, has that all of those other ones don't have, is that it's on the table, it's passed by the Security Council of the United Nations, and so it has a status that those other arguments don't have. Misha, are you worried about the legality of it? Or not?
Well, it's not so much that I'm worried about the legality, but basically it means that, you know, the UN resolution. I mean, the UN resolutions were overridden. UN resolutions were overridden in Iraq. We know that. UN resolutions were overridden actually in 1999 in Kosovo as well. But this is. It seems to me we're getting into a kind of you know, rather futile argument of, you know, of one lot saying, you know, we shouldn't have recognition, another lot saying we should have recognition, and we're not looking at the political process involved and how you go about getting resolutions. So that Daut, for example, accuses me of holding a position which I've never articulated. And that is a kind of, this is a kind of, you know, it's a futile exercise. How do you go about getting both Kosovo and Serbia integrated into the European Union? That's really what we're talking about. And at the moment, we've rather screwed that up. We've screwed it up partly because the lead powers in this process of recognition were not the European Union, it was the United States and it was Russia. And the US, which had said before the process was completed that whatever the outcome it was going to recognize Kosovo, were anticipating a particular solution. And the Russians quite simply, you know, were able to put their feet up on the table and say, we're going to lift our veto at the UN. And so the EU, who are going to pay for Kosovo, who are going to pay for the Balkans if it continues to be the mess that it is, and my God, you know, if we think Kosovo is difficult, you wait and see what happens when Macedonia doesn't get its NATO membership in Bucharest next week. That's a big, big problem. We're going to have to clean it up. And for me, this represents a failure of the European Union, which should be taking the lead in Kosovo, in Serbia, and it's not. And so what we have to be looking at is, can you find political processes which resolve the situation? And if you look at Kosovo itself, everyone involved in these negotiations knew that this state was going to be partitioned in some way after the status was arrived at. But nobody dared say it because they're cowards. And that's actually what I think we're going to end up with. We're going to end up with some form of partition. We ought to recognize what on earth is going on the ground in Kosovo, and who is going to go into Northern Mitrovica and assert it as part of the Republic of Kosovo? I don't know. Is KFOR going to be doing that? I very much doubt it. You know. So let's talk about what's really going on.
KFOR are there.
Yeah, no, they're there, but they're not asserting. This is, you know, you've got 5 governments operating in this tiny territory of 1.9 million.
There are only 2 governments at the moment, not 5. But anyway,
There are 5 authorities.
There is the authority of the Kosovan government elected democratically and UNMIK. EU hasn't started working yet. Anyway,
Yes, but
Wait a
you
minute,
know-
Misha, wait a minute.
Can I, if I could go back to the breach of international law, which is sort of a trap that Koštunica has built with Putin as well. There is, in that law, Kosovo has declared and is perfect sort of recognition and recognition, declaration and recognition of independence. What you have to have, according to the international law, to make a state is a certain territory, to have a people there which share a common culture and common language and common history, and you have to have a government. Kosovo has fulfilled all these conditions. But going back again to the political process had to continue. Political process could have continued forever between the Serbs and Albanians, but there would not be a decision at all, because the Serbs will stand in their positions and Kosovans, the Albanians, in their own positions. So there will be no agreement at all. Then, well, if we want to see the situation inside Kosovo now, why the Serbs are making all these troubles? Because they are controlled and directed by Belgrade, and Belgrade is telling them that you need no rights, you need territories. This is why they do not accept the plan that has been made all these years about decentralization, giving them local power, giving them everything they want, and also giving them everything that what was prescribed and described in Ahtisaari's plan. Just see the status of rights the Serbs have there, and compare it with what the Albanians, what 30% of the Albanians have in Macedonia. Just look at this.
Is that right?
Actually, I will start with the actual role of Kosovo Serbs. I'm afraid the relations between Kosovo Serbs and the Serbian government are and have been extremely complex in the last few years, but also in the 80s. Essentially, they've acted, for the most part, as fully autonomous actors. Essentially, have a social movement down there, in the same way that you had in late 1980s. Of course, Serbian governments have fully supported the cause of Kosovo Serbs, simply because they couldn't ignore them, because Kosovo Serbs and their cause is very popular within Serbia. But they have hardly been able to actually control their actions. Only last week we had protest of Kosovo Serbs in Mitrovica, which was fully autonomous. The Serb government simply cannot control these people. What they are doing, they're actually defending their rights.
Except almost everybody with a job in North Mitrovica is paid for by the state in Belgrade.
Of course they are.
That's a measure of control, isn't it?
It is a measure of support for Serbs over there. Otherwise, they will simply have to leave. That's the only way. They don't have jobs. They receive little support from the international community. They're essentially a vulnerable minority over there. Without the support of Serbia, they could just, take their stuff and leave. That doesn't mean that they are actually controlled by the government.
I don't really buy this argument that they're completely autonomous. I mean, everybody's known there's been Serbian police from Serbia, from Ministry of Interior in Mitrovica for years. And I think that when the UN say that it was them who was orchestrating the violence on the 17th, I mean, people don't just suddenly appear with kind of hand grenades and things which killed the Ukrainian the other day. I mean, I think that means that they're not really completely autonomous. And not only that, I think that anybody who has a different view, especially now, and who might like to stay in their job, be it in KPS or in any of the other institutions, simply intimidated and told, forget it. And I really don't, so I don't agree with that.
And Serbs cannot simply stay in KPS simply because the responsibilities of the UN are gradually transferred to the Kosovo government. If they would accept this, that means that they would recognize the legitimacy of Kosovo as an independent state, and they will never do this.
Let's talk
This is very dangerous. You see what the Serbs and the Serbian government say about it. They say what you can see about this is, you know, you see the Croatian syndrome. The government in Belgrade is doing with the Serbs in Serbia exactly what they did with the Serbs in Croatia. You go in everything or nothing. So if you achieve everything, you stay, but you'll never achieve everything. You say at the end you'll follow what they did in Croatia. So you will have to leave, and this is the government, the Serbian government is forcing them to do. But this has to do with the partition, of course. Partition will be a very dangerous thing to initiate, and the Serbian government came openly, finally came public and openly yesterday with Samardžić and his plan when he visited northern part yesterday. And Oliver Ivanović told him, listen, you guys so crazy, you don't know what you're doing. This means that you take the northern part, but what happens with the majority of the Serbs? Because there are more Serbs living inside Kosovo than in northern part. They'll have to leave because you make them to leave. So you have to forget it. Then this is very dangerous because this is not supposed to happen. This is why Britain and this is why America is very much against, very much supporting independence within the territory that Kosovo has the map today. And what it happens, the Albanians will start thinking when Serbia takes the northern part, fine. This was their part, but we have our own part in southern Serbia as well, which is called Preševa Valley. So let's start and get our what belongs to us, what the Albanians will think in Macedonia. In order to put an end to this, just say to these sort of a fascist theories, say it's end. Ukry bas. There was in Albanian this slogan. If you were in Pristina, you probably have seen it. You know. And having in mind what the Serbs' plans are, what the Serbs will not recognize independence, Mr. Damaci came and said, listen guys, it's not over. Wipe that word out and instead of that, you know, replace it with it has just begun. You know, it's so dangerous.
Let's open it up to the floor now. And so there must be questions. Yeah, do you want to wait for a microphone to get to so that everybody can hear? And maybe, if you like, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Alex. So a question to Mr. Glenny then. If what the gentleman says is correct, if a partition will open up Kosovo claims to Kosovo residents in Serbia, what does that mean?
Well, it's a very, you know, I wasn't saying that partition is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'm saying that's what was happening, that everybody knew, including the Albanian side, that Northern Mitrovica was basically out of the game. That because nobody in the independent state, whichever authority it is, has the power to assert Kosovo government authority in Northern Mitrovica. Okay, so you're dealing with a situation on the ground which you simply can't shift, and this could have been worked out. I mean, I don't agree with you in terms of you know, this has always been the Serbian position. Zoran Đinđić and Hashim Thaçi were talking very, very detailed about sorting this situation, and if Đinđić hadn't have been assassinated, I think that Kosovo would be off the agenda by now, myself.
Right.
So, which tells us one thing, is that there are political differences in Belgrade. There are shifts, there are nuances, and the idea that there is some immutable politics in Belgrade, or indeed for that matter in Pristina, is simply, it's a false assumption.
Well, let's ask Nebojša that, because we talk about Belgrade wanting this or that. In fact, we should ask who in Belgrade is controlling this, who in Belgrade is pursuing this agenda. The way that the cards have fallen now in Belgrade, Nebojša, what are the choices now that political leaders are facing in Belgrade, and how are the constituencies lining up?
Well, the main choice at the moment, before the May election, is essentially about the relationship with Europe. It's not that much about Kosovo. Of course, Kosovo is in the background and will remain there. But key groups actually contending for power at the May election actually more or less agree in terms of the policy towards Kosovo. Now the question is whether they will also be aiming at European integration at the same time. the question of slightly different policies that Misha actually mentioned with respect to Kosovo, to what extent some would accept partition, others would not. Well, this would certainly depend on the political context at the particular moment in time when this question arises. But as it stands at the moment, Prime Minister Koštunica, as well as the Serb Radical Party, would not actually accept partition.
When you say partition, you mean
I mean
the independence
formal
of Kosovo?
partition, the independence of Kosovo south of the river Iber, and the joining of the northern Mitrovica part to Serbia.
Right.
Now, what the recent proposal of Minister Samardžić was about was essentially a transitional arrangement, an attempt to give self-rule to Kosovo Serbs until the status issues have been resolved. So it doesn't have anything to do with partition. On the other hand, Democratic Party of President Tadić, while also saying that they are not in favor of partition, may actually accept it in the future. Again, these are informal talks and the rest of it, but they would be more prepared actually to accept partition at some point in the future.
And what is the decision to recognize Kosovo independence done to the standing of the European Union in Serbia?
Well, clearly the government is not there anymore, so we'll have the election. If you look only at these key kind of policies towards Kosovo and the EU, key parties, again, two key actors, President Tadić and Prime Minister Koštunica, have more or less similar position. It seems to me what has actually happened is that Prime Minister Koštunica changed his policy. In 2004, when he became a prime minister, he actually created a twin-track policy, one on Kosovo, that Kosovo will remain part of Serbia, and then Serbia will use all legal kind of ways to keep it there without actually using force. On the other hand, that would not in any way prevent integration of Serbia into the European Union. So these two issues were completely separated. After that, Democratic Party of President Tadić also accepted this position. Prior to that, they didn't really have a policy on Kosovo. It was all over the place. Now, what has happened recently, because of the unilateral declaration of independence and because of the recognition of large EU states and the US of independent Kosovo, it seems that Koštunica actually now thinks that the European integration is not that urgent at this point. Perhaps it wouldn't happen anytime soon anyway, so it's important to focus on Kosovo. On the other hand, Tadić is very strongly for integration simply because he thinks without integration Serbia will not be able to keep Kosovo. It will be economically underdeveloped, politically unstable, and that would actually backfire. So essentially you have two slightly different positions.
And so you potentially reach a position in which, odd though it seems, if that happens, you've got Kosovo marching down the road towards European integration more quickly and more further advanced than Serbia.
Well, I think that Kosovo is economically is a lot further behind. But I have to say that I did hear a phrase which I'd never heard before recently, which was that mirroring an older phrase. We used to talk about Kosovo and Serbia proper, and in Brussels the other day, Misha was there as well. There was somebody started talking to me about Kosovo proper, meaning obviously Kosovo proper meaning Kosovo Albanian inhabited areas. So in theory, I mean, I take your point, but I don't think that that's going to happen. But I have to say that I had to laugh this morning when I saw that Mr. Koštunica believes that Serbia's possible relationship with the European Union in the foreseeable future could be similar to that of Norway and Switzerland, which has happened to be not just the richest countries in Europe, but I mean, as everyone knows, along with Iceland, the richest countries on the planet. And I do think that there could be delusions of grandeur creeping in there.
Yes, here, yeah.
I just got a quick question on whether you think or not tensions are going to uprise again and there's going to be civil unrest and ultimately conflict between Serbia and Kosovo. I mean, there's such a long history of emotions between the two countries. I can't see how Serbia is going to sit tight and accept the fact that Kosovo is now independent.
Misha, do you think there'll be conflict between Serbia proper and Kosovo proper?
No. However we're defining it. I mean, there will be problems if KFOR and ULEX decide that they, insist that Northern Mitrovica bows to the government in Pristina. That's the only way there are going to be problems, and I don't think either ULEX or KFOR are going to go, or UNMIK for that matter, are going to go down that road.
And apart from the presence of those international security forces, what's different about now to, say, 15 years ago? Why will there be no conflict now?
I don't think that anyone is really particularly interested in conflict in the region.
No one wants it.
I remain worried about Bosnia-Herzegovina. I remain worried about Macedonia, but I've always been worried about those two particular places, and so there's nothing new there. I mean, the point about Macedonia is that if Macedonia fails because of Greek stupidity to become a member of NATO, then the government in Skopje can offer its constituents, to wit the Macedonians and the Albanians, very little that can't be offered by other people in the region. And so that is a very fragile, weak state. Bosnia-Herzegovina remains a very fragile, weak state. We're not out of the woods yet, and I hope that the Kosovo process, had the Kosovo process gone in a way which was consensual finally, then I think we would have been out of the woods. But we're not yet, unfortunately.
Tim?
No, well, yeah, no, I agree, but I just don't think there could have been a consensual process, and not with these leaders anyway.
Yeah, but I agree with you essentially on that, but the process was not decided in Belgrade or Pristina. The process was decided by the great powers, and it was contested by the great powers, and that's why it's tricky.
Do you accept Misha's main point here, that the whole thing was flawed from the beginning because America and Britain, essentially, and their allies, told the Albanians, sit tight, because when it fails, we'll have no choice except to offer you...
This is not serious. No, I don't think they ever mentioned this. I don't think they came to talk to this level. But coming back to the question that was put to Misha about tensions, I don't think we know the answer. I don't think Misha and me and others know that answer. It's all up to the governments in Belgrade to do this. They have done it, they have produced crises all the time, and you go and ask people in Kosovo what they think about it. They live in fear still about this, that Serbia is going to do it, because this is what Serbia has been in business of making wars. Serbia hasn't made anything lately apart from wars. Then the other problem is that
come on,
Serbia has built garrisons.
But
Serbia is building garrisons along the border of Kosovo. So how do you feel yourself? Just put yourself into the shoes of an Albanian inside and see that garrisons are being built in Preševa Valley. The Serbs are attacking your border every day. The Prime Minister of Serbia is saying this and that about the Albanians, about the Serbs. You live in fear.
Nebojša, address Misha's point that if Zoran Đinđić, she's putting a lot on the shoulders of one man, if Zoran Đinđić had lived, we'd have had a final status solution by now that everybody could agree on.
It's impossible to answer that question. I mean, we'll never know. My guess is that he was serious about it, but the very question is whether he would get support within Serbia for this solution in that particular context. Probably not, because he didn't have it for other sort of policies that he was trying to actually implement.
Yes, here.
My name's Timothy Less. I'd be interested to know what the panel thinks are the regional implications of Kosovo's recognition of Kosovo's independence.
What do you mean regional implications?
For Bosnia and Macedonia. And I'm particularly interested in what these three have to say, because Misha Glenny has already offered.
Well, I should say that when Misha was my colleague at the BBC, whenever we talked about Bosnia and Macedonia, he was known as Misha Gloomy. So we do know what Misha's view on that is. Nebojša.
Clearly, if you have a precedent in terms of legitimating secession, then clearly a demonstration effect will be more serious within the region, especially since we are talking about former Yugoslavia, in which problems are actually interconnected. So clearly in Bosnia, we already have a highly decentralized state consisting of two highly autonomous entities. And if you grant essentially a recognition to Kosovo, then of course, Serbs in Bosnia would expect something similar. We have already seen in the last year or so a substantial increase in hostilities within Kosovo. I mean, when I say hostilities, arguments, not really violence. But this is substantially worse position than we had only a year or two ago. If you look at Macedonia, I think that is even a worse proposition. At this particular moment, the Ohrid Agreement has to some extent calmed down the passions, but this is only a temporary arrangement. What we have in Macedonia, which is actually especially explosive, is demographic trends which will change the proportion of the two main groups in the population. And as we know from other sort of conflicts, such as Israel-Palestine, Northern Ireland, Kosovo as well, demographic trends can substantially exacerbate conflict. And it seems to me that we will hear quite a lot about it in the next decade or two.
Why has nothing happened in Republika Srpska? Why has there been no attempt to say, well, if Kosovo can have it, so can we?
For one thing, for the time being, only 30 or so states have actually recognized Kosovo. So this is still not a precedent that would lead to the substantial demonstration effect. If we get to the position that, over 100 states do so, which seems highly unlikely at this point, then, of course, many people will think about it. Already, there is a strong popular pressure in Republika Srpska. Earlier, many people were simply withdrawn from politics in Republika Srpska. Nobody really cared about who governed. At this point, it's substantially different. You see quite a lot of grassroots activity. Within a few years, that may actually lead to substantial pressures for secession. Again, this will depend on the broader international and regional context.
Tim?
Well, I agree with that up to a point, but I think that I think that the important thing to look at here is the position of the leadership of the Republika Srpska, and I think that the people like Dodik, the Prime Minister of Republika Srpska, are only too happy to use Kosovo in their fight against Sarajevo. But I think that just as they don't want to be told what to do from Sarajevo, I think ultimately they don't want to be told what to do from Belgrade either. And I think that at the end of the day, they really would rather be bosses of their own little place and big fish in a small pond.
I would agree. Prime Minister Dodik actually mentioned that if Republika Srpska actually seceded, it wouldn't actually join Serbia, but it would exist as a separate state.
So if the question is Bosnia, I don't really know what's happening there, and as an Albanian, I don't think I should care about it.
Macedonia?
Yes. Macedonia, yes.
Well, that's
it's a different.
The man's question was, are you worried about the regional implications?
No, it's the key of all problems in the Balkans is Serbia. If Serbia has decided to make problems, Serbia will have problems. If Serbia has decided to take a peaceful way and prosperity, there will be, Albanians will stay as they are, but if not, there will be troubles in Macedonia, of course.
Misha, is there an unresolved Serbian national question in the Western Balkans?
No, I mean, for me, the Serbian national question is largely, resolved. Bosnia does remain a problem, and here I think that domestic politics in Belgrade is very important. If you were to see a coalition government of the radicals and Koštunicas DSS after the May the 11th elections, I would be very worried about Bosnia, particularly if there was further disappointment as far as Belgrade is concerned vis-à-vis Kosovo. I think that Bosnia is something that Belgrade does hold as a kind of time bomb if it wants to create big problems in the region. I don't think that you can say that Macedonia is Macedonia's fate is up to how Serbia behaves. I mean,
it is. Well, if you look to what the Albanians and Macedonians have said 5 or 6 years ago, the Democratic Party of the Albanians in Macedonia has clearly said, and all Albanians and even VMRO to a certain degree agreed with the political situation in 2001, and they said, the PDS said that if Kosovo is not going to be recognized with the borders it has today, then it will be impossible to control the Albanians in Preševa Valley and Macedonia. So that's a bad thing.
But let me just say one thing about the whole regional context. The regional context has changed dramatically. Romania and Bulgaria are members of the European Union now. Croatia is very close to becoming a member of the European Union. Albania is moving forward both in the EU and in terms of NATO membership. This whole concept of positing the Balkan situation as being, you know, it falls or stands on, you know, on Serbia's attitude or Albanians' response to that, seems to me to be sort of anachronistic. That's not what's going on here. What is trying to happen is to see how you can get this undoubtedly very difficult nexus of peoples and states and territories integrated into the EU, so that, as in my opinion in Northern Ireland, the sort of, you know, magnetic effect of the EU dampens down nationalism as a driving force in place of, you know, sort of rational exchange and economic development, which is really what people are crying out for in this region. And, you know, we haven't, you know, we've got to an extent sidetracked by the national question. What's going to happen to Kosovo's economy now? You know, I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent, or whatever, but what are the plans? Who is, you know, who's looking at investment in Kosovo? How we're going to move this place forward? I mean, that's why I said at the beginning, this is, you know, this is the EU's question. We have to face this and start looking at concrete, positive ways out of what is still a messy situation.
You see, the very aim of the Kosovans declaring independence was this, what you said. They declared independence primarily to get rid of the Serbian regime.
Fine, but what's the economic program? What's the strategy?
They wanted to build the society in two pillars, which is security and economy. And again, we coming back to the same point. It all depends to the Serbs. If Serbia does not accept, if Serbia insists in partitioning Kosovo, there will be no security, and there will be no international donations. There will be no international business who will be willing, you know, to move in. Will be not willing to move in not only in Kosovo, but they will ignore Serbia and the entire region as well. So it's up to Serbia. If Serbia has decided to make troubles, the region will be in trouble for the next 1 or 2 or 3 decades. If not, prosperity will be there.
Tim.
Sorry, I've lost my stream. I thought that, no, actually, I do know what I was saying. I mean, my hunch is that, I mean, I may be kind of overly optimistic here, and of course it partly depends on what happens on May the 11th, the date of the Serbian elections, but my hunch is that somehow the region is going to stabilize over the next few months. And but what I feel more than anything that we've talked about here is the unexpected. I think that the problem could really be if something really just comes out of the blue. I mean, I say that because it really struck me 2 or 3 weeks ago. I went from Pristina to Gračanica, which is the Serbian enclave outside of Pristina. And I went to look at the church, the medieval church there, and what really shocked me was that there was absolutely no security whatsoever. And it really struck me that, you know, if I'd been a nut, I mean, you know, if I'd been a nut, I could have just gone in and, you know, left the knapsack full of explosives and blown it up. And then you'd have had a kind of Kosovo's 9/11, and everything would change. And that's what worries me kind of actually more than all of the things that we think that we can see and all the problems. It's something just out of the blue.
No, I don't think, Tim, you should worry, because those priests who worked there, they knew that those monasteries and churches been there for 7 centuries and nobody has touched them.
Yeah, but you need a nut. I mean, but, you know. No, I agree. I mean, in a rational world, you know, yes, I agree.
Yes.
I agree with you, but it just
Okay.
takes it just takes you know, someone who is literally a nut.
Before we go into the floor, let me just ask Nebojša to pick up on that Irish analogy. I mean, in the early 1920s, there was a treaty between the new Irish state and Britain, which had enjoyed sovereignty there, which the subsequent Irish governments and indeed constitution repudiated and continued for the best part of 60 years to regard the British sovereignty in Northern Ireland as illegitimate, as illegal. But they got on with the business of, eventually, it took a long time, they got on with the business of building a new kind of state and joined the European community, as it then was, along with Britain in 1973. There was an open letter by Kouchner of France and Carl Bildt of Sweden, published last week in Figaro, in which it was full of blandishments and compliments to the Serbian people and what a great contribution the Serbs have made to European history over the centuries. But essentially what it was saying was, we're really sorry about Kosovo, get over it.
I'm afraid that's unlikely to happen. Certainly, you know, important political factors and political parties within Serbia believe that, you know, this is the situation that we have on the ground. We have to live with it. You know, we won't recognize Kosovo as an independent state. We will support Serbs in economic and other ways, political ways if possible. We won't use force.
Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying.
At the same time,
The Irish Republic, let me go back to the Irish Republic refused to recognise British sovereignty in the 6 counties, while all the time developing a very positive relationship.
That's
with the
exactly what I'm
United Kingdom.
saying. That's exactly the strategy of Boris Tadic. And it used to be the strategy of Prime Minister Koštunica until a month ago. So that's the main idea, essentially, to do the same thing. The only difference here between Ireland and Serbia and Kosovo is actually a very different political context. Serbia is a bigger partner here, and Kosovo is a smaller one. So you have different power relations there, and it's unlikely actually to work that way.
Great. Let's have a question or a point or an observation from.
I guess I have 2 questions. I would ask Daut if you have a plan for imposing Kosovo control over northern Mitrovica. I mean, it seems practically speaking, it will be very, very difficult.
No, there isn't one. You know, even if Kosovo government had one, UNMIK will intervene and undo everything. This is the big problem. You know, what happened lately last week with the troubles with Serbs rioting and occupying the court building, and the UNMIK gave order for the police forces to intervene, and the international administrator was against it. So now, it has never been a plan. It has never been a clear plan to involve both the Albanians and Serbs into coming into an agreement about Northern Ireland. Nobody had a plan. The only plan that someone had was Serbia.
Well, wouldn't Kosovo flexibility over Northern Mitrovica
Wait a minute.
be a surprise?
Sorry, can I just get this question again?
No, we sort of dealt with it. Let's get some more points.
Yeah, moving on from that, Richard Brown's my name. Aside from north of the Ibar River, what do you think the future for the minority Serbs in the enclaves dotted around Kosovo is? What's their future?
It depends on the deal that is made between Serbia and Kosovo. I mean, if
Let's assume there isn't going to be one soon.
I mean, there are 2 possibilities essentially. One is the Bosnian model, which is Serbia recognizing Kosovo as an independent state, which would remove obstacles to its recognition by all other states, and you know, Kosovo could become a member of the United Nations. At the same time, the Serb areas, northern part of Kosovo, as well as enclaves, would become a highly autonomous Serb region or entity, which would be extremely autonomous, self-rule for Serbs, but also there would be some power-sharing arrangements at the center, as well as links with Serbia,
But you
confederal
see, in
links.
Ahtisari's plan, they are autonomous. I mean, there is no need for any other deal. They are completely autonomous.
If I can just finish it, sorry.
You can finish it, you know, but you have no point. That's the problem.
That was one option. The other option is partition. If that happens, meaning that, you know, Kosovo south of the river becomes fully recognized by Serbia and other states as independent, and the northern part actually joins Serbia. In that case, the fate of enclaves would have to be dealt with partly through perhaps something similar to Ahtisari's proposal, or simply they would, you know, be offered an option actually to get compensated for their property and actually moved to
But hold
Serbia.
on, Nebojša, as I understand it, I mean, a majority of the Serbs still in Kosovo live in these areas we're talking about. They don't live in North Mitrovica. And the supervised independence plan that is on the table at the moment, in which they all assure us is going to be implemented, includes provision for this wide-ranging autonomy that you're describing.
And not really. What it includes is a very limited municipal autonomy. It doesn't have anything to do with full territorial or statutory autonomy. Now, I mean, this is a generous plan. If you would talk about minorities in some states where never has been a serious conflict, no large-scale violence, no regional conflict. In the case of Kosovo, or perhaps Sri Lanka, or perhaps Northern Ireland, it is simply a non-starter. So it is too weak in terms of the support for minority groups.
Just very briefly, when you go there, you see that there's a certain democratic reality, demographic reality kicking in, and that compared to Mitrovica, which has young people, professionally active people, those areas tend to be at the upper end of the demographic age spectrum.
The enclaves.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, yes, of course. Well, I mean, they're pretty small places, and there's not much for young people to do. There's not much work for anybody in Kosovo, and if you're a young Serb, you've got the whole of Serbia at least to go to. So yeah, of course.
So will
And
they
it's not
still be
just
there in 10 years?
Maybe they'll still be there, but I mean, they're not viable by themselves. I mean, clearly. But I have to say that given goodwill, which there isn't, of course, but there isn't. But given goodwill, there's Europe. Europe is a place full of interesting places and precedents, since we love to talk about precedents. And I love the precedent of the town called Livia, which most people have never heard of. But Livia is a Spanish town inside France. And, it was in the 1680s the Spanish lost a war. The border was changed. The treaty said the 34 villages of this region on the border will be transferred to France. And the people of Livia said, well, actually, we're a town. And still to this day, Livia is a Spanish town, but 3 miles inside France, totally surrounded by French territory. And it's been there ever since the 1680s, and I wouldn't be surprised. Who knows? Another generation of leaders, whether Gračanica is not a new Livia. I mean, there's a precedent.
Yes, Nidhi Trehan, LSE Sociology. I guess what I would like to ask is about another community or another ethnic group that hasn't been mentioned in the discussion tonight. That is the Romani community, which consisted of close to 120,000 people prior to the violence breaking out. And this is Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptians, including the affiliated groups as well. I guess what I wanted to ask about is, first of all, this is a question for the Western journalists on the panel, is why in the last, let's say, 10 or even 20 years of coverage of the issue, Roma and Romani issues have not been mentioned. And particularly after the ethnic cleansing of Roma, about 80,000 Roma being ethnically cleansed in the last few years. Why hasn't that been mentioned?
Misha.
Well, there have been books written on this subject. Some of them have sold very well. I don't think it's been entirely ignored. Although I do agree that throughout, it's frankly not just the former Yugoslavia and Kosovo, it's throughout Eastern Europe. This has remained a peripheral subject for the Western media, and it's partly because the Roma population have no state aspirations, and they are not involved in games around statehood. And I suspect that's why you'll find that they don't have the prominence.
Do you agree with those statistics, 120,000, 80,000?
In Kosovo? No.
Can I just say, as far as statistics, the numbers, it's interesting, to hear that 120,000 Roma and 50,000 Egyptian. I was surprised when I heard that there are Egyptians in Kosovo, but anyway, there are. And there are, 200 or up to 400,000 Serbs. It comes that Kosovo is a huge country and has sort of 5 million people. And the numbers are, these people are there. Numbers are big. But the problem is, I think your question was why nobody takes care of them. Was this the question? It's because the world and everyone wants to look after the Serbs. And they have completely forgotten that there are other people who live in Kosovo. That's the answer.
Tim.
Well, yeah, I don't agree that it has. I think the subject has been pretty well covered. But I mean, I also agree that there's a question of political weight, and unfortunately, they have no political weight. But I don't think that it's been. I don't think it's been uncovered. Don't agree with that at all.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Nick Pisani. I just wondered whether you mentioned demographics on several occasions, whether actually the problem might just solve itself in 5 or 10 years, and that if you're a young Serb in your 20s and all you're used to is conflict and economic deprivation, or indeed in Kosovo, and experiencing the same, and you have the prospect of EU membership, peace, harmony, economic prosperity, won't over time that just replace the bitterness which we can see from the body language still exists from what's on the panel?
It would if the EU gave the Serbs visas to come to the European Union, but unfortunately...
Wait a minute,
the problem is that there is no such prospect. There have been some gradual moves towards European integration, but overall Serbia has had quite a few problems on its road to the EU, despite actually exporting quite a few of its generals, former presidents, and the rest of it. So, I mean, the prospect is still not there. Perhaps it may be there within 10 years' time, but at this point, there is very little to choose between, especially if you're a Serb living in Kosovo in one of the enclaves.
Why does EU membership remain a harder sell in Serbia than in any other country currently outside the European Union and Europe?
Well, because Serbia, after the fall of Milosevic, had to some extent unique problems. It had part of its territory under the control of the UN. It had quite a few problems with old security services. Old regime forces have been very strong all along since the fall of Milosevic, polling around 30 to 40%. So with all this baggage, despite substantial efforts by all governments since 2000, it's been hard. And at the same time, there have been quite a lot of conditionality coming from the EU that didn't occur in other states. If you look at Croatia, for example, there was some conditionality over there about war criminals or those who were charged with war crimes. But to some extent, the EU was more lenient than in the case of Serbia. So here we are.
Misha?
Well, I mean, this issue of the European Union really is critical to the whole situation in Serbia. The EU hasn't sold itself terribly well anywhere in the Balkans. It basically sort of says to the Balkans, look, if you want to do what we're asking, then you can be a member. But there's very little outreach, and there's also the fear of in Serbia of double standards, so that Bulgaria, for example, which we know has a real problem with Justice and Home Affairs Directorate, and there are a number of people in the European Union who tried to stop Bulgaria in particular, or at least slow down Bulgaria coming in. The Serbs feel as though they've been hit by a triple, quadruple whammy on the European Union because of the War Crimes Tribunal, because of organized crime and corruption, and because of the Kosovo issue. And so it's been harder for Serbia to get there. But I am absolutely sure that Serbia within the next 10, 15 years will engage with the European Union for the following reason. The Koštunica and the radicals, who can stand up and have a very sort of declamatory position on Kosovo, and also create a kind of apparent relationship with Russia as a political strategy. This is a fantasy, and actually I'm sure Koštunica knows it, but it's a complete fantasy. What does Russia offer to Serbia? The whole gas deal, not just with Serbia, but the whole of the Balkans, gas and oil, that's all sorted out. The Russians have it sewn up. Russia is not interested in creating a political community in southeastern Europe. The European Union is. And the Russians know this. The Russians have made it plain to the EU that they do not want the Kosovo business to damage Serbia's road to Europe. They made this very, very explicit. And so, you know, I think that Serbia will turn to the EU as its long-term strategy within the next 10 to 15 years, and something will be sorted out over Kosovo. I mean, actually, in the midterm, I'm quite optimistic. As I've always said, Macedonia, Bosnia, worry me in the meanwhile.
Yeah.
Jeremy Broadbent, just picking up on the point Misha was making about Russia.
They're not working.
Just picking up on the point Misha's making about Russia.
Sounds from what you're saying, a lot of what Russia's doing is posturing. I was interested in this sort of threat that was being, a veiled threat that was being made before Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence, that Russia might be playing mischief in Nagorno-Karabakh or Abkhazia and places like that. So I'm just wondering how influential Russia is going to be, and how much Kosovo may be a sort of bargaining chip in terms of sort of the wider picture of EU-US sort of Russian relations.
Can I say, I want to come back on this, the way that, I mean, Russia starts to become active in Kosovo for reasons which are not to do with the Balkans. They are to do with missile defense, they are to do with NATO membership of Ukraine and Georgia, and they are to do with the frozen conflicts, but above all, they're to do with two separate issues in terms of international politics. One is that Russia is saying to the United States, you don't walk in and decide what's what before consulting us properly, number one. And the other one is that Russia likes to see the European Union bugger things up. And that's what the EU has done. Now, Russia has not expended any political capital over Kosovo. All they had to do was put their hand up in the Security Council on this. You know, Russia's not, you know, worrying about what's going on in southeastern Europe at the moment. It has its deals there, it has its energy strategy, and that's all fine. But it is saying to both the US and the EU, consult us first, and then we may come to a deal. And don't place missile defense without talking to us about it properly, first of all. That's what that's about. It's not to do with Kosovo.
Nebojša, what about this view that Misha articulates, that this idea that Russia is going to embrace Serbia in some kind of political territorial community, if you like, that rivals European hegemony in Southeast Europe? It's complete fantasy. If it is complete fantasy, why does it have such popular traction?
Well, it is highly unrealistic. I would agree with Misha. I mean, you know, the main economic partner of Serbia is European Union. It's over half of its trade goes there. You know, Serbia essentially just imports energy from Russia. Apart from that, there are very little links. Of course, support of Russia was important and is still important for Serbia in terms of dealing with the Security Council and getting support in terms of the recognition of Kosovo as an independent state. But in the long run, it's highly unlikely that Russia can or actually want to support Serbia in much stronger political terms. Most political parties, important political parties in Serbia, realize this. The only problem is that we still have a very influential party from the old regime, meaning the Serbian Radical Party, which is extremely influential, still polls over 35%, and it's still possible that it will form a government with other coalition partners after May the 11th, although it's not fully certain. They have been known as quite unrealistic bunch, so they tend to cling to such fantasies.
Daria Peshkova, Russian television. I just have a question. All these men on the panel are talking high politics and geopolitics, which is important, as we know. But I have a point. I mean, we're being told here that none of these monasteries have been touched for 700 years, that we have a picture presented of the Albanians who are sitting there fearing Serbian aggression and scared that the Serbs will do something very, very scary. We have a picture of the Kosovo Albanians who say, why should we care about Republika Srpska or Bosnia and Herzegovina? We only care about our own Kosovo. So my question is, who cares about the minorities? Okay, it might be not that many Romas as we've heard, but there is a minority there. We have the minority Serbs. So who's going to care about the people, and what is going to happen to those people who live there now in a minority and who might not be attacked directly just because there's such a strong international presence there at the moment, but as somebody told me, you know, Kosovo as an independent state, if it happens, is going to ensure that all the Serbs and all the minorities, their life will become so impossible to continue in that little new state that they will have to leave. So the question to the panel is, what about the people?
Dasha, this is interesting, because let me just, since you're on your feet, Dasha, and you raised that important point. I went from Kosovo straight to Moscow, and what was just a month and a half ago, and what was striking was that it seemed to me that the Russians were even more outraged by the Declaration of Independence than the Serbs were. And this
I was making the point because I'm Russian, so I assume that's why.
But this is Misha's point that the Kosovo Declaration of Independence was politically useful to Putin at a politically useful time because of the hay he could make with it. Why do the Russians care so much about this?
Well, quite frankly, I just think that in all this geopolitical talk, Kosovo is being used by pretty much everybody as a political leverage. But no matter who, are we talking about Russia? Are we talking about the European Union? Are we talking about the international institutions? Nobody is...
I'm sorry to...
yeah. Why does Russia care?
Why? This has touched a nerve in Russia that the siege of Sarajevo didn't touch. The Srebrenica massacre didn't touch.
Well,
why?
Usually it is being said that it's the big Russian-Serbian Orthodox relationship that goes back centuries and centuries. I don't know. I wouldn't really say that I've just spent 2 weeks in Serbia, and I've been to Serbia before. I've been to Bosnia and Herzegovina. I've been to Croatia. I've been pretty much the whole region, and I have to say that it's a highly messed up region to me, and they can't sort it out between themselves. But why the Serbs feel so strong about Russia, I probably know. It's the big brother. Why the Russians feel, maybe it's the emotional part. And as a woman, I'm raising an emotional question. Who's gonna care about the people?
This is obviously this question is addressed to me. So, you see, the problem between the Serbs and the Albanians is about history. It's about how much you remember. It's about what belongs to what. If you had known this, you would have not asked this question. Because does it surprise that the Albanians regard those two monasteries as being Albanian? This is why they never touched them. But then you have to know one more question. There are two sorts of Serbs in Kosovo. One that we called Serbs who lived in Kosovo forever, who were there, and Serbs who the Belgrade regime brought when colonized Kosovo in 1912. Albanian land was confiscated and given to them. This was a huge number. Albanians and even the Serbs who lived in Kosovo never accepted this kind of Serbs. And whatever churches they built were destroyed by the Albanians lately. This is the answer.
But I'm not asking
No, wait a
about
minute.
the past. I'm asking about the future.
Dasha, let's move on.
This is the future.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Let's get another.
Right. Pavel Andreev, Russian journalist as well. Sorry. So I'll be picking up on Misha's point about Russian position, answering your question, Alan, as well. So you are right about Russia playing geopolitical card here. But Russia, another point which you didn't say is that Russia cares about its own regions. Alan said that. We have a huge problem in Chechnya. We don't want whoever it is to support separatist movements in our country and then decide by themselves whether this region should be within the Russian Federation or not. The question to you again, sorry, to the supporters of the independence of Kosovo, we're obviously yet to see how good economic managers the KLA commanders are. Looking at the international at the international sort of outcome of the independent Kosovo, how this would spill out in the world. Is the independent Pristina going to rush and support its so-called, let's say, brothers in arms, the independent Abkhazia and South Ossetia?
Right, okay.
Was it for me?
Well, it's for
I didn't really
it's for
understand the
everybody.
question.
You see,
Was it about?
Can
anyone help me here?
Hold on. Let me just make this point. It seems to me that I mean, I think you've conceded in the body of that question that the Russian position on Kosovo has got not very much to do with Kosovo itself and everything to do with Russia's own backyard. So, does it look like? I mean, sum up your question.
I mean, just be honest. There was no question here.
Is independent Pristina going to recognize the independent Abkhazia and South Ossetia?
Listen, I don't think...
Are these things connected? Are these things connected? That's the question.
No, these things are not connected. But you see, international politics, you enter into relationship with the nations that you need them. I don't think it's good, and I don't think it's any benefit of Kosovo mutually recognizing Abkhazia or Kosovo, or Abkhazia recognizing Kosovo or Fiji or Sri Lanka. Mind you, Sri Lanka is important for Kosovans because Kosovans drink a lot of tea, but they used to drink tea anyway before they became independent. So there is no connections into these small nations and coming up and saying we should not recognize Kosovo because a certain state there has a certain problems. You know, Kosovo has. You cannot really blame Kosovo if China has problem with Tibet. If any other country has a problem with anyone, Kosovo has become independent, perfectly okay, even according to the international law. And this is what is more important is the international players in the international politics and arena have recognized Kosovo. If I was a president or Prime Minister of Kosovo, I wouldn't care about any other. 40 or 50 have recognized Kosovo. I wouldn't really be worried if I wake up in the morning and seen a telegram coming from Ahmadinejad and Chavez and Gaddafi that recognize Kosovo. But that doesn't really matter.
Tim, I mean, clearly they think these questions are intimately connected, though it doesn't think there's any connection at all.
Well, you know, and I have to say that I tend to think that if people in Quebec or in Tibet or are going to move towards independence, they will do so on its own merits and whether they can do it. And you could argue that the precedent, of course, was the breakup of the Soviet Union itself, but it didn't provoke other countries to break up. It was Yugoslavia, the three communist federations, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Okay, but did that set a precedent for these other places? Well, no, it didn't, I don't think. And the other thing is that, you know, you bring up Abkhazia, which is, of course, a very interesting case. What's so interesting about Abkhazia, having just been there recently, is how, you know, a place like Sukhumi, the capital, was destroyed in 92, 93, at exactly the same time as Sarajevo. And the huge, this brings us back to, you know, Misha and the European Union, and how people in Sukhumi, which is of course backed by Russia, still live amongst the ruins, whereas Sarajevo has been rebuilt. And I think that that's an important point which needs to be made as well, you know, which does have a kind of link to the Balkans, that, you know, what's Russia going to do? Nothing.
Nebusha?
I mentioned already earlier that it's inevitable when you have a recognition of one state that it will have a demonstration effect in other places, in the region and elsewhere. Now, when you say a demonstration effect, that doesn't mean, you know, tomorrow, it doesn't mean next year. It means simply that secessionist and potentially secessionist movements across the world will gain confidence that if you use force, then it can pay off. When I say use force, I didn't mean that, you know, Kosovo Albanians were not justified in using force. And I agree with Daut. It doesn't really matter, you know, why would Kosovo Albanians care what happens elsewhere? But it will matter. And once you have actually recognized one state, then it becomes much harder actually to refuse recognition to other states, because various states, various secessionist movements have very good reasons for actually demanding independence. So once you start with this, then it is very hard to stop.
Misha, the domino effect.
No, I have one final thing to say, and that is, again, the European Union. The European Union has stumbled over this, but it has to pick itself up, and it has to keep focusing on Albania, on Bosnia, on Croatia, as well as Kosovo and Serbia and Macedonia. And you know, this region has a way out that, as Tim says, you know, Georgia does not have a way out. The Maghreb frankly, doesn't have a way out. And both sides have to grab the possibility and work politically and not work according to national stereotypes.
I'm going to call it to close there. It's 9 o'clock. We're over our time. Thanks to our 4 panelists. Thanks especially to all of you for coming out and taking part so intelligently and so enthusiastically. The conversation, I'm sure, will continue one floor down. If you're not a member of the club and you want to join, ask somebody downstairs about how you become a member. Thank you very much.